I have told the story many ways since that night. I have told it as a misunderstanding, as a slip, as something that sounds worse out of context than it was. None of those versions held. What held was the image of Robert Marsh going very still, Daniel's father, a man who had just said something kind to me for the first time in 5 years, and the room going quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The champagne flute was in my hand. The candles were still burning. I had been trying for 5 years to make that family see me as someone worth choosing. I succeeded that night in making all of them see me very clearly indeed. My name is Elena Marsh, and at 34 I was the kind of woman people described as vivid. That was the word they reached for most often, and I had trained myself to hear it as a compliment rather than a diagnosis. I was a marketing consultant, skilled at reading rooms, practiced at knowing how much of myself to pour into any audience, good at making strangers feel by the end of an evening that I had come to that gathering specifically for them. My husband Daniel used to say I was the most interesting person in any room I walked into. He said it with genuine pride, and I accepted it without examining what the quality required to sustain. We had been married 5 years when the restlessness started. I can point to one Sunday morning in late October, the ritual still running, his coffee made the way I liked it, oat milk and 1 sugar and no cinnamon, though he preferred cinnamon and had never said so, a fact I would not learn until much later, after everything, and one that has stayed with me in ways I can't fully explain. The playlist I built the winter we got engaged was playing from the speaker, phones in the bedroom, his idea, from early in the marriage, still in place. That Sunday I sat across from him, and the ritual was correct, and I could not locate what was missing. He asked gently what I was thinking about. I said nothing in particular. He said I seemed somewhere else, and that if something was bothering me, he would rather hear a hard thing clearly than watch me be absent without knowing why. I said everything was fine. Later that week I found a note in my coat pocket. His handwriting, 4 lines, no date, written years earlier. He had recorded something I said about a documentary we watched, my exact phrase, and below it he had written that he thought about it on the train and believed I was right. The habit of leaving those notes had ended somewhere in year 3 or 4 without a conversation or a decision. I read it twice and put it back in the pocket. That night he came to bed after me and asked whether I was truly all right, whether anything was sitting heavily, because the last few Sundays had felt different and he didn't want to miss something. I said I was fine. He said okay. He turned over. I lay in the dark thinking about the note, and I did not get up to tell him I had found it. That was the first thing. Between October and December, my social performances shifted in register. They had always been vivid. That was simply how I understood myself. But during that autumn, something in them turned from vivid to urgent. At a work holiday party in early December, I held the room for 4 hours, moving from group to group with the ease of someone who has been doing this since childhood. And for those 4 hours, the low-level restlessness I had been carrying since October was completely absent. I was entirely present. I drove home, and by the time I came through the townhouse door, the feeling had already drained away, and by morning I was back inside the same quiet frequency. Priya told me over wine that Thursday that I had never looked better. She said some people peaked later and thought I was one of them. I received the compliment without examining what it was covering. The Kellerman dinner was the 2nd Saturday in December. We had eaten with Marcus and Claire Kellermans several times without incident. That evening I sat across from a man I had never met, a colleague of Marcus's from his firm, and I gave him the full range of my attention for most of the meal. Not flirting, I told myself that clearly, but performing at my highest capacity towards someone who was openly receiving it. By the time the dishes were cleared, the table's energy had organized itself around the exchange between us, and everyone there could feel the specific texture of what was happening. In the car home, Daniel asked about it with his voice level and his eyes on the road. He described a specific moment, the one where the man had refilled my wine glass before Daniel could reach the bottle, and I had laughed in a way that carried across the table. He asked whether there was something happening that he needed to understand. He said he wasn't looking to argue. He was looking for the truth, because being able to trust the person sitting beside him in that car was the foundation every evening rested on, and that being trusted in front of their shared friends was something he had always understood as given between them. I told him he was being oversensitive. I told him that if he found it threatening when I was interesting to people other than himself, that was his insecurity to manage. I said this in the flat tone of someone who has correctly identified the problem. He drove. He said quietly that what he had observed had not felt like warmth directed at the table in general. It had felt specific, and the direction was not toward him. He asked me to think about that. I said I would. I didn't. In fact, what I did during the following week was the precise opposite of thinking about it. I attended client meetings, wrote a proposal for a new account, called Priya twice about nothing in particular. The question Daniel had asked was somewhere at the back of everything, sealed in a room I was comfortable keeping locked. It didn't occur to me then that the feeling the Kellerman evening produced was that strong precisely because I hadn't been generating it anywhere else. The period between that dinner and Robert's estate gathering had a specific quality I can name now but couldn't then. Daniel had started keeping his work calendar on his phone rather than the shared app. He was in the study more, the door less often open. He answered questions with a precision that was slightly more careful than usual. I told myself each change meant pressure at the office. I was skilled at finding the explanation that required the least further examination. A second dinner happened in early January at a colleague's home, and the pattern repeated. Daniel was there and watched with the expression of a man filing something, not reacting to it. He said nothing on the drive home. The following Saturday we were at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes still out, the small wire fruit bowl sitting in the centre the way it always had. He said he had been going back over the previous months, and there was a pattern he needed to name. He described what he observed, my attention consistently redirecting away from him and toward whoever in the room was most visibly offering it back, and said, with both hands flat on the table on either side of the fruit bowl, that a home was built on both people being honest about what they were carrying. He said he could not build around something he was not allowed to see, and that the household they had made together required a minimum of transparency to remain what it was. I told him cataloguing my social behaviour was not love. It had more in common with surveillance than with partnership. I told him I had been who I was for 34 years, and he had always claimed to love that person. And if close proximity had become a problem, I wanted to understand what had changed on his end. He looked at the fruit bowl for a long moment. Then he said he understood. He went to the study. The study door closed. I sat at the table for a few minutes, the fruit bowl between my hands, the empty coffee cups from the morning behind me on the counter. I went to the dishwasher and loaded it, and told myself the conversation had ended in my favour. Priya came over 2 days later and I told her Daniel had become jealous, and the travel had made him insecure. She said that made complete sense and that I had probably outgrown the dynamic. She refilled the wine glasses and changed the subject, and I let her the way I always had, because that was the shape the friendship had taken across 20 years. Then Daniel mentioned the estate dinner. His father Robert held the annual gathering every January. 12 guests, the champagne from the same French producer every year, a tradition going back to before Daniel and his sister Justine were adults. He said Robert had asked after me by name, and had specifically mentioned he was looking forward to the evening. He noted this was different from previous years. I told him it was good news, that Robert was finally coming around after 5 years. I was already planning what to wear. He looked at the fruit bowl while I said that, the same careful, private attention he had given it during the argument. And something in the quality of that look made me pause for a fraction of a second before I finished my sentence. I finished my sentence and kept talking. I arrived at Robert Marsh's estate in Westlake that January evening, having prepared everything I could think to prepare. I had chosen the dress carefully, spoken to Priya that afternoon, and arrived with a specific plan. Be warm, be genuine, give Robert and Carol the version of me they had never quite been willing to see. The estate was a stone house with a formal dining room, 12 candles down the length of the table, family portraits along one wall, and the atmosphere of a room where rituals had been performed long enough to become load-bearing. I had been to this dinner 4 times before and felt like a visitor each time. I was determined that this would be the year that changed. Robert met us at the door and was warmer than he had been in 5 years of knowing him. He asked about my work with specific interest, mentioned a recent campaign he had read about and found impressive, and used my first name twice in the first 3 minutes. I registered all of this as the door I had been waiting to walk through. The champagne was opened at 7:30. I accepted a glass. The restlessness I had been carrying since October was quieter than it had been in months, because the room was working the way I needed rooms to work. By my second glass, the conversation was flowing, and Robert was attentive, and the evening had the texture of something going genuinely well. By my third glass, the distance I normally maintained between the performance and whatever was underneath it had narrowed in a way I did not notice until it was already too narrow. Between the toast and dinner, Robert came to find me near the window. He said he had something to say that he had been meaning to say. He spoke in the careful way of a man who has rehearsed something. He told me he had not been as welcoming as he should have been, that he could see what I brought to his son's life, and that he was sorry it had taken this long. He used words like vitality and clarity. He said Daniel spoke about my work with visible pride. He looked at me directly while he said these things. The warmth of it landed on something old. Not on me as I was standing there at 34 with a glass in my hand. On something behind that, a much older version of me in a different dining room, in a house where the man at the head of the table managed my presence with the patience of someone handling a recurring inconvenience. What Robert was offering was recognition, genuine and unhurried, from a man with authority in the room. I know now what it did to the hunger I had been carrying. I did not know it then. What came out of my mouth came out in pieces. I said I appreciated what he had said. I said I had felt like an outsider in the family for years and it had been hard. And then I said, in a voice that was quieter than I intended, and not nearly quiet enough, that I had found myself thinking about him in a way I should not have, that I had wanted him in a way that had nothing to do with being his son's wife. I said this clearly, without apparent awareness of what I was saying. The butler's pantry door was open. Justine was standing 3 feet to my left, facing away, not moving. Gerald Watts was directly across the room. Carol Marsh had come in from the kitchen a moment earlier and had stopped walking. The 2 guests nearest the window became very still. Robert said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, "They should find Daniel." He looked at me as he said it, and the expression on his face was not anger and not disgust. It was something I had never seen directed at me before, and have not been able to stop seeing since. He turned and walked toward the dining room. Justine appeared in the hallway a moment later with the expression of someone whose suspicion has just been confirmed, who takes no pleasure in being right. She said nothing. She took out her phone and typed something, and a few minutes later I heard Daniel's phone vibrate twice from somewhere in the house. I went to the butler's pantry. The room was small, 1 overhead bulb, the smell of cleaning fluid and old wine from bottles stored along the wall. I stood on the stone floor with the champagne flute in my hand, crystal, the D and E monogram facing toward me, and for 45 seconds I stood completely inside what I had done. I saw the room. I saw Robert's face. I understood with full clarity that something had happened that could not be revised. Then I covered it. The reflex was faster than the understanding. I told myself Robert had misunderstood, that the champagne had produced a sentence that didn't mean what it sounded like. I straightened. I set the flute on the pantry shelf and picked it back up on the way out without thinking about it. Daniel came in from the back garden where he had been taking a call. He looked at the champagne flute in my hand and asked calmly what had happened. He said his father had told him in specific terms what was said, and he was asking me to say it in my own words, because this was a situation that affected everyone in that house, and he needed to understand it directly from me. I told him Robert had misunderstood something I said. I said the champagne and the emotion of the evening had combined badly, and a sentence had come out wrong. He looked at the flute for a moment. Then he went to the entryway and came back with both our coats. In the car, he told me precisely what his father had reported, I said. He named it. He said he wasn't asking whether I had said it. His father and 2 other people had been there. He was asking whether there was anything I wanted to tell him about what had produced those words. He said his father had made a genuine effort that evening, and what had come back had permanently changed something in that relationship, and he needed to know whether there was anything underneath it that belonged to the 2 of them. I told him he was taking the worst night of my life and making it about how it had affected him. My eyes filled. I said I had been humiliated, that I had said something terrible, and that what I needed from my husband right now was not a second interrogation. He looked at the road. He said nothing else. He pulled into the drive at home, parked, and went upstairs. A few minutes later, I heard the guest bedroom door close quietly at the end of the hall. Robert Marsh sent a text 11 days after the dinner. It said, "I hope you find the help you need." He did not specify what kind. He did not need to. The family's reorganization was quiet and efficient. Nobody sent a long accusatory message. Justine stopped texting me entirely. Not dramatically, simply the way a person steps out of a conversation they've decided has nothing left for them. Carol sent 1 email with the subject line "checking in on you both." 3 sentences that communicated everything while saying nothing specific. I told myself Daniel had gotten to all of them first, that families circle when they need to protect someone. I did not ask myself whether the protection was warranted. Daniel had been sleeping in the guest bedroom since the night of the dinner, having moved a pillow and his phone charger upstairs while I was still standing in the hall. The guest bedroom was the door at the end of the hall that had always stood open for visitors. Now it was the door that was closed most mornings and had the quality of a room being lived in. One morning in late January, I looked through the kitchen window into the back garden. Daniel was sitting in the outdoor chair at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. He was not on his phone. He was not doing anything at all, elbows on his knees, eyes somewhere in the middle distance, present in a way that had no audience. He was sad in the specific way of someone who has not yet decided whether to feel something or file it, and I watched him through the glass for nearly 2 minutes and told myself he knew the window was there and was positioning himself for me to observe. I told myself this because I had never learned to recognize grief that wasn't also performing itself. The man in that chair was not managing a situation. He was inside one, the specific private sadness of someone who has understood something they were not ready to understand, and I watched it through the kitchen window and called it theatre. I turned away and made the coffee and did not go outside. 2 weeks later, I told Daniel I thought we should see a therapist. I said this in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning in a measured, unhurried tone. Not an apology, more a proposal, a person laying out terms the other party would be unreasonable to refuse. I said I knew the dinner had been terrible, that I knew what I said had come out wrong in a serious way, and that I wanted to work on the marriage. I had decided therapy was the appropriate next step. He met me at a cafe on Clement Street that Saturday, already seated when I arrived, a coffee ordered for himself and 1 for me. He had been there long enough to have chosen the table. He asked what I thought had produced the incident at the dinner, not the champagne and not the timing, but the actual internal thing that had generated that specific sentence in that specific room. He said he was asking because he needed to understand it before he could understand what help would be useful to either of them. He was completely calm. He said he was trying to take this seriously and needed me to meet that seriousness. I said the champagne had made a hard year worse. I said the accumulated distance and Robert's warmth and the emotion of the evening had combined badly, and something had come out in a form it shouldn't have. He looked at his coffee for a moment. He asked, "So one therapist would address all of those things?" I said yes. He said he would think about it. He never scheduled the appointment. The second conversation happened in the kitchen the following week, later in the evening, and the guest bedroom door was visible from where we were both standing, open at the end of the hall, occupied by a pillow and a phone charger that hadn't been there a month ago. He said he had a question he wanted to ask directly. What did she need from this marriage that she had not been getting? Not a list of his failures. An honest answer about what was missing and what it would look like if it were present. He said this because the room at the end of the hall was not where he wanted to be indefinitely, and because a household they had both made together required both of them to say a true thing. I told him the way he was asking, careful, structured, waiting for me to produce my own psychology on request, was exactly the pattern I had been trying to describe for years. I said intimacy was not an intake form. My eyes filled. I said I had been trying to be seen by him for a long time, and that what he was offering right now felt like another version of the same problem with different furniture. He looked at me for a moment. He said he understood. He went to the study. The following Monday, I walked past the study and the filing cabinet was locked. It had always been there in the corner, housing years of household records, and it had never been locked before. The key was on his personal keyring, which had moved from the hook in the entryway, where both our keys had always lived, to somewhere I could not locate. His laptop had also moved permanently to the study. The kitchen table had nothing on it now but the fruit bowl and the morning coffee cups. I told Priya he was locking things away as a way of performing the withdrawal he wanted me to feel. She said, "Yes, probably." She said it in a voice that was choosing its words more carefully than it used to. The following Sunday, Daniel did not make the coffee. He was in the study before I came downstairs. I made it myself, oat milk, 1 sugar, and stood at the counter and drank it. And the speaker on the shelf was quiet because the playlist was on his phone, and he had not turned it on. That evening, I walked past the study and heard him tell someone on the phone that he would have everything ready by Thursday at 3. The door was almost closed. I stopped in the hallway for a moment and then I kept walking. In March, I hired a family law attorney. I made the call from a meeting room at the office during my lunch hour, before Daniel had sent me anything formal, which was the point. Having representation before he did felt like being a step ahead of something, and being a step ahead was the closest thing to control I could construct. I told Priya that evening. She said it made sense and that I should protect myself. She said it in a voice that was doing some visible work to sound neutral. Marcus Hale, a senior partner at the firm who had been Robert's professional contact at the estate dinner, asked to meet with me at the end of March. The meeting was not on my calendar. It lasted 12 minutes. He referenced recent client feedback, used the phrase periods of reduced focus, and said he wanted to make sure I had the support I needed during what he understood was a personally difficult time. He did not specify what he understood. I said everything was fine. I went to the bathroom afterward and ran cold water over my wrists for a few minutes. The following Thursday there was a dinner at a mutual friend's home, and Daniel did not come. There were 8 people at the table, most of them in both our social circles, and at some point the conversation turned to family and in-laws. I told the table my version of the estate dinner, that I had said something personal and vulnerable at a moment when the champagne had lowered my guard, that Robert had taken it in the worst possible direction, and that Daniel had chosen his father's interpretation over mine. I said this looking at everyone around the table, making it the established story, the one they would carry into their other conversations. Priya was there. She was quiet while I spoke, with the expression of someone reaching a decision they had been postponing. When I finished, she smiled at the person beside her in a way that did not reach her eyes. One of the other guests, a man who knew Marcus socially, looked at his phone twice while I was talking. I did not ask myself at the time why he was looking at his phone. I drove home that evening and told myself the narrative was now established in enough minds that it would hold. I did not consider that establishing a version of events in a social circle was a different thing from establishing it in a mediation room where the record did not belong to me to write. What I had done at that dinner table was not protecting myself. It was spending credibility I was about to need. The conversation at home happened that Saturday morning. Daniel asked me to sit down. He had nothing in his hands and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the posture of a person who has already decided not to be defensive. He told me he had attended 2 therapy sessions on his own. Thursday mornings, a therapist near Civic Centre. He said he was not telling me this to compare efforts. He was telling me because he had examined what he had done wrong in the marriage, loved by solving when presence was what was needed, made decisions before asking, built provision into caring without asking whether provision was the right currency. And now he was asking me, plainly, did she want to stay married to him? He asked it looking directly at me, with no visible strategy attached to the question. I said I didn't know. He said that was an answer he could work with if I was willing to work with it too. He named the guest bedroom at the end of the hall, the fact that it existed, that he had been sleeping there for 2 months, that neither of them had agreed to make it permanent, and he offered 1 session with a therapist of my choosing, on terms I set, where I said whatever was actually true. Not a confession. The truth of what I had been carrying and what I needed. He said he was asking me to trust him with it one last time. There was a moment, while he was saying this, where I could see that he had crossed the thing I had been asking him to cross for years. He was sitting inside the feeling without trying to fix it. He was asking without the plan behind the question. I saw it. I recognized what it was. And I told him it was still solving, because if I admitted that it wasn't solving, I had to answer the actual question. And the actual question was one I had been keeping sealed away since I was 9 years old, in a house where the man at the table looked past me with the patience of someone managing an inconvenience. I said the offer, different room, different method, same underlying instinct, was him resolving the situation the way he had always resolved situations. I said I did not want to be a problem he was working through. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said he would handle things properly from here. He said it in the tone of someone who has been carrying something quietly for a long time and has privately decided the carrying is finished. No anger in it, no escalation, no visible shift in expression. He pushed the kitchen chair back under the table and went upstairs without looking at me, and the kitchen was very quiet after he was gone. That Sunday morning I came downstairs and the kitchen was empty. I made the coffee myself, oat milk, 1 sugar, no cinnamon. I sat at the table alone and held the cup in both hands and had, for a few seconds, the specific experience of understanding what the Sunday mornings had been. Not a ritual, not a habit, but someone who preferred cinnamon-making coffee without it for 5 years without once saying so because he was making it for me. The seconds passed. I opened my phone and texted my attorney. On Friday morning he was in the kitchen before me. He handed me a coffee without ceremony and without comment and went upstairs. It was made exactly the way I liked it. I stood there holding it and didn't know what to do with the fact that it was. The process server came on a Tuesday morning. He said my full name twice before handing me the envelope. The divorce petition named the date of separation as the evening of the estate dinner. Attached were temporary orders freezing the joint savings account and the joint credit line pending the first hearing, scheduled for April 14th. The supporting documentation included statements from Robert Marsh and Gerald Watts, and notes from 2 of Daniel's therapy sessions, which he had released with his own consent. At mediation, the mediator was Sylvia Park, and 23 years in the work were visible in her attention, which absorbed everything and responded to none of the framing. I presented my account, the estate dinner as an isolated incident produced by accumulated stress, the champagne, a hard year, and a genuinely emotional response to Robert's warmth that had expressed itself badly. I said the context mattered. Sylvia Park wrote something in her notes and asked whether I had a clear understanding of what had produced the incident internally, not circumstantially. I described the champagne. She moved to the next item on her agenda. My version of events produced no response in the room. It passed through the proceeding the way a document in the wrong format passes through a system, received, but not assigned to anything. The hearing was scheduled, the proceedings were underway. When I returned to the townhouse to collect my things, Daniel had arranged to be elsewhere. There was a box by the front door with my name on it in his handwriting. Inside, the sea salt from Portland, still half full, a necklace I thought I had lost, a book I had mentioned wanting to reread, and one champagne flute, crystal, the D and E monogram, catching the light from the hallway. The other 5 were in the cabinet behind glass. He had kept 5. He had given me one. I had spent 5 years performing my way toward being chosen. I believed the performance was my power. What I understand now is that it was the specific thing that had made me impossible to stay close to, that the hunger to be seen by everyone, in every room, at every table, had made it impossible for me to simply be seen by the person who had already been looking. The 45 seconds in the butler's pantry were the moment I understood that and covered it anyway. Everything after came from covering it. The flute went into the box. The box went to storage. The Sunday mornings went somewhere I don't have a name for yet. Closure snapshot. The furnished rental on Haight Street is month to month, and the kitchen has no ritual attached to it. I make the coffee every morning, exactly right, and drink it alone. 3 couples we used to see regularly have been politely unavailable since the mediation. Priya and I speak occasionally, carefully, in the way of 2 people who are not yet sure what the friendship is now. Robert Marsh has not been in contact. The first hearing produced agreements I signed without contest. I work from a hot desk on Market Street, no assigned space, nobody leaving notes under the cups. The champagne flute is in a storage unit on Fillmore Street, in the corner, still wrapped in packing paper. I have not decided yet what to do with it.